Hey everybody. So yes, I am wearing a sweater, actually a sweatshirt. So I kind of look a little raggedy, but I'm cold. It's actually kind of a chilly day here in Florida, which is very unusual, as you all know. But it's just kind of chilly out and I just can't get warm, so I have a sweatshirt on today. So please forgive that if that makes anybody feel weird, like what's going on there in Florida. But we get to start now with the book of Daniel in our Old Testament series. And I'm not sure how long or how many sessions I will do in this book, but I really want to really get into Daniel quite a bit because, as you probably know, if you've looked at it at all, and I know most of you have, it's kind of unique in all of the prophetic books. It doesn't read a lot like some of the others, and it just has a whole different flavor to it. And that's because it really is very much about the last days. So before we jump in, I'm going to give you a lot of background information, and we'll see how far we get into all this and how far we can actually get into some of the actual scriptures today. But I really want you to understand the context and the history behind what's going on, because it really helps to make sense more of what's going on. As I've mentioned several times to you, what's happening now at this point in history in Israel is that the northern kingdom has been completely, Israel has been completely taken over by the Assyrians. Then the Babylonians take over the Assyrians, and so Judah is all that's left, the southern kingdom in the land of Israel, and they're about to fall to the Babylonians as well. That happens in a process. That doesn't happen overnight, although typically we look to the date of 486, 487 BC as the date when Babylon takes over Jerusalem, takes over Judah. That's because that's the date when finally Babylon has had it. And they've just said that's enough is enough, and the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is taken. And so that's kind of the ending date. But what we often forget is many, many years before that, there was a process going on where Babylon was already basically making Judah like a vassal state, like making them dependent upon Babylon, bringing them into subjection, if you will. And that began a process where they would take Jewish people and deport them to Babylon. And I have on here kind of the historical order of events that are important for us in terms of understanding these prophetic books, where they all fit. And you'll notice that I've highlighted some of the names of the prophets we're going to still look at in terms of end days stuff. They're highlighted in yellow, and then a couple other things I'll talk about there in the purple. But I want to kind of go through it and make sure you understand what I've done here. Again, this is kind of like a timeline, but it's going down. And I know I've showed this before, but it bears repeating because it's so important to understand what's happening here in this last days. So the first time where Babylon really begins to kind of flex its muscles under Nebuchadnezzar is in 606 BC, when he takes away a lot of the really top-notch younger generations, the people that would be the future leaders, if you will, of the country. It's actually a fairly smart strategy because he's figuring, if I can get them, then their future is not going to be real bright for Israel. They'll be subject to us, to Babylon. So he goes after the younger generation, the young leaders. And Daniel is in that deportation. So is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by the way. They're a part of that whole group too. And they were probably fairly young, possibly even still teenagers, or maybe older teenagers or young college age, somewhere very, very young. And they get taken to Babylon in that deportation. And then there's another little minor. You see there in the parentheses, it says minor number 1 in 598. That's another small group of people. And honestly, there was probably at least 6 of these, which I've listed here, but could have been more, where people were slowly taken to Babylon, almost kind of like prisoners. It was just the strategy that Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon was following, was, how we're going to take over. We're going to take away the leaders, the good people, or at least what they felt like were the good people, and we're going to kind of make them subject to us and flex our muscles and make Israel subject to us. So there were some major deportations, 3 major ones and then 3 minor ones, but there very easily could have been more than that. But the ones we focus on in terms of scripture, what's going on, are really the 3 major ones. So the first deportation in 606, that's the biggie. And we're not sure what the total number of that one was, but we know that that's when Daniel was taken. Then there's another major deportation in 597 BC. And remember, dates are going backwards because we're going from older dates to 0. So we're kind of counting down towards 0. 0 being technically the year that Christ was born, although that was probably more in 4 BC, but we won't go here or there for that right now. But the point is, the time is going backwards in terms of how that we think. So in 597 BC, there's another deportation, and this is the one that Ezekiel is taken to. Now, he's older than Daniel, and the only reason I don't talk about him first is because really Daniel starts jumping into prophecy right away, shortly after he's there, because he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and that kind of puts Daniel, if you will, on the scene. Ezekiel is in Babylon as well, but in a different part, and his ministry is more of a typical type of a prophet, but he's prophesying to the Jewish people that are in Babylon. And he dies much younger. We don't know exactly when, but we know because he's older to begin with, he does not survive as long as Daniel does. So that's why I talk about Ezekiel after it, even though in your Bibles, Ezekiel comes before the book of Daniel. But really, Daniel chronologically covers a larger period of time. So that's where we're going to cover him now. And then there's the third deportation in 586 BC. And this is when Judah does finally get completely taken over. Babylon destroys the temple, carries away all the goodies from the temple. And this is when Nebuchadnezzar gives Jeremiah that choice that I talked about when I talked about Jeremiah. Do you want to stay in Israel, stay in Jerusalem, or do you want to go to Babylon? And Jeremiah chooses to stay in Israel, although then he lands up being taken away by his own people. They have to run away to Egypt because they try to rebel against Babylon. Doesn't go too well, so they all take off to Egypt to kind of go hide, and Jeremiah goes with them, and he's probably much older as well. So there's overlap. What I'm trying to get through, there's overlap between Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, and I think Obadiah too. I'll talk about him in just a second. But they're in different places. Daniel's more in the leadership, in the government headquarters for Babylon. Ezekiel is more in some of the outskirts of Babylon. Jeremiah is still in Jerusalem, but they do overlap each other. But Daniel is the longest in terms of where they all fit. So they're, if you were to put them in a chart together, Daniel would kind of be the long one. Jeremiah would be right at the beginning of it, and Ezekiel would be kind of in the beginning towards the middle of it. And then he would be over. So that's how that kind of all works. So keep that in mind in terms of the context. And why that's important is because you need to understand now, especially with Daniel and Ezekiel, that the people reading their books and listening to them preach and prophesy at that time, they're going to see their country be destroyed. And so they now obviously are going to look forward to a future, because now they know that indeed all the prophets were right. Jerusalem got destroyed. We have not been obeying God, and indeed he is disciplining us. We do not have our country anymore. So they all are automatically going to be thinking, what's our future now? What happens? Now, of course, as I talked about with Daniel, when I was talking about Jeremiah, was they're going to have a whole lot of hope in 70 years, but a lot of the people are going to be gone in 70 years. So this is like the next generation is going to kind of take up, okay, now what do we do with when Daniel gets to the last of his book, when he's prophesying that the 70 years has passed now. So it's really that younger generation that's going to be able to go back. But like I've said many times, what comes back to Israel, and this happens if you keep going down my chart here, this comes during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, the last part of the history in the Old Testament. And who comes back? It's not that impressive. In terms of just numbers, like the first return you see down on the chart down here. Let me go circle it with my mouse. See here, the first return, and then a second, and then a third. During this period of time, like the first return is the biggest, there's only 50,000 Jewish people. That had to be a really, really small group. If you think about the fact that going all the way back to the time of Moses, there were several million Jewish people. So by this time, there had to be millions upon millions of Jewish people. Now, a lot of them had been destroyed, with Israel being taken over and even Judah being taken and a lot of war. But there still had to be at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jewish people. So who comes back to the land of Israel in these returns is a really, really small number of people. And that's interesting because they're going to think in their minds, oh, we must be that remnant that all the prophets prophesy about. I've talked about that so many times about the remnant that's going to come back. The problem is, if they were the remnant, none of the other prophecies that say follow the remnant have come to pass yet. Specifically, the Messiah coming back and setting up his kingdom on this planet, with his headquarters at Jerusalem. So you have to kind of just do a logical deduction and say, you know what? They were mistaken in thinking that they were the remnant. They were a remnant, but they're not the remnant of end times status. And of course, we know that because we have the advantage of looking back now, 2020 vision. We can go back and we realize that because Jesus hadn't even come on the scene yet. There was no Messiah yet. And they even know now to this point, even Jewish people today would realize that wasn't the remnant of the end days because the Messiah didn't set up his kingdom on the earth. So that's kind of interesting to think about, but also exciting because it means we still need to be looking for that. And that's what I've been arguing here for the Old Testament prophets, that there's all this end times stuff talked about that has not come to pass yet. So that's what we're going to dig into now. So then what do these prophets have to say about the last days? What are we still looking for? And of course, I've brought a lot of that up already, but Daniel especially is going to give us some really specific things to look for. I'm not going to talk about Obadiah. He's up here in purple. And I'm not going to spend a video on him. It's just a chapter, if you could even say it's a chapter long. It's just one short little book. There is prophetic emphasis to it because clearly the end of the book is messianic. It's looking forward again to the Messiah. But his specific message is really against the kingdom of Edom, which in our days would be modern day Jordan in terms of the area. But in those days, this was the area that Esau and Esau's descendants settled in. And his word was really strong against them because what happened when all this stuff was going on with the Babylonians taking over Judah, the Edomites, because if you look at a map geographically, the Israelite people would have to go through Edom, and a lot of them would run to hide in Edom as the Babylonians would take them captive and go north. Well, what a lot of the Edomites did, remember there's a lot of bad blood because this is Esau. This goes all the way back to Esau and Jacob, so there's a lot of bad blood between Edom and the Israelites. What the Edomites did is they would kind of tattletale, if you will, on the Jewish people, and they would tell the Babylonians, hey, here's some Jewish people, they're hiding over here. Or they would block, it even says it right in there when you read the scripture, they would block ways for the Israelites to go hide. So in other words, they did not help Israel at all. And they were brothers, in terms of blood brothers. It goes all the way back to Abraham. They were actually giving up their brother, if you will, to the Babylonians. So God has a very strong word against Edom for doing that to his brother, and talks about their destruction, and actually talks about their future destruction as well, to where they will totally not exist anymore. And that's because they're going to be grafted in as well. Those that really do believe in Jesus the Messiah, they're going to come back and they'll be apart, brothers will be reunited. And so the division of Edom and Israel won't exist anymore. That's end days. So Obadiah foreshadows that, talks about that, but doesn't talk at length about it. He really focuses more on that present day of Edom and how they're going to be judged for what they did in that day and time. So that's all I'm going to say about that book. And I don't want to underplay his importance by any stretch, but since this whole series is focusing upon end times prophecy, that's what I want to really zero in on. So let's dive into the book of Daniel now. And I'll come back and talk more about Haggai and Zechariah, Malachi and Joel, their prophets when the Jewish people start coming back after the 70 years, beginning there in the first return, as it says on the chart. But I'll come back and we'll talk about them more at length when we get there. So that's a few more videos down the road. They have a ton, especially Zechariah, and Malachi and Joel have a lot of end day stuff, because now, especially, they're beginning even to realize that, wow, what all the prophets have talked about, even though we're kind of back on our land now, this is not what we were expecting. This is not the future that we're still hoping for. So Zechariah, Malachi, and Joel, especially Zechariah, really kind of emphasized to the people, hey, there is still a really huge future coming. Ezekiel does that as well. But they're still kind of, during the time of Ezekiel, they're still hoping it's going to be after 70 years. But by the time you get into Zechariah and Malachi and Joel, the Jewish people realize this isn't it yet. There's still a future coming. And then actually, that's really kind of the time of Christ as well, where he's reminding the people it's not yet. I had to come first and die. We had to take care of the sin problem first. Then all this end time stuff is going to happen. And of course, we're in that time where we're still waiting for that as well. So with that whole overview, hopefully that kind of gives you some context, historical context in terms of where things fit. I want to dig into Daniel here, and I want to talk about some interesting facts about Daniel, and then show you how it's organized, and then give you a really, what I think is a logical way to read it. And then I'm going to ask you to read it, because it's only 12 chapters. And I'm going to ask you to read it all before you watch the next video after this one. That's because I think it really isn't a really difficult book to read when you read it in chronological order. It's just very difficult to interpret. Like, what are some of these things? There's so much detail, especially about a lot of the history going on in the kingdoms. And what does this mean? What does that mean? And honestly, some of it is probably stuff that we'll understand better in the future when we actually see it play out. But nonetheless, at least go and read it and try to make sense of kind of what's going on. And I'm going to help you here with the facts about the book and kind of how it's organized and whatnot. So, as I mentioned, Daniel came to Babylon as a young man in 606 BC under King Nebuchadnezzar. And he quickly rose to a high position. He was a lot like Joseph. He interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and in fact, even deeper than Joseph, Daniel actually had to find out from God what the dream even was. Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't even tell anybody what the dream was. So Daniel had to find out from God what the dream was, and then interpret it. So it's crazy. I mean, it's just an unbelievable move of God and it really saved Daniel and his friends, because they were all part of the wise men of the day, and Nebuchadnezzar said he was going to kill them all if they couldn't tell him what his dream meant. Kind of tells you Nebuchadnezzar's a little bit schizophrenic himself, and he has some interesting things. But nonetheless, Daniel rises to power there, because Nebuchadnezzar realizes, oh my gosh, this is really a guy that knows what he's doing. And then Daniel completely outlives all the Babylonian leaders, because, like I said, he's there for all 70 years of their captivity. And so he's there when Cyrus comes on the scene, and Cyrus is Persian. And so he sees Babylon fall. So Babylon actually falls in a relatively short time. Now, they had been a world power for several decades before Jerusalem got taken, but on the whole scheme of kingdoms, Babylon didn't last that long. They were a fairly short-lived kingdom, under 200 years, most likely. So, and Daniel gets to see that change. And in fact, we probably only know a lot of Daniel's ministry during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and then after Nebuchadnezzar died, Daniel kind of disappeared. I don't want to say disappeared, but he kind of folded into the woodwork, because none of the other kings really apparently liked him, because none of them really had much to say with him, had much to do with him, until Belshazzar, who's the last king of Babylon, and I'll show you that here in a second. So he kind of has a great ministry, then he kind of falls quiet, and then he comes towards the end of the 70 years, then he comes kind of back to power and famous again, if you will, because he interprets some more things for Belshazzar, and then under Cyrus he has a lot of things, a lot of visions that God gives him. So it's an interesting ministry, kind of really kind of going strong, then kind of nothing, and then strong again. It's just an interesting ministry that he has. His ministry time period, would have been like 536 to about 530 BC in terms of his end, and that's the time during Cyrus. So a very short period, 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 or 6 there. So he had to be at least 80 to 90 years old at the end of his ministry. And this is the time when Cyrus allows some of the Jews to return. And like I showed you in the last slide, about 50,000 in that first return, and then a few thousand more in the second and third returns. But the first one was the one under Cyrus. Each chapter is a topic in the book of Daniel. With the exception of 10, 11, and 12, they go together. They're one topic. And the chapters are not in chronological order in the book of Daniel. And I'll show you in a second how they are organized. And when you realize that, it does actually make a lot of sense. In the oldest Bibles that we have, some of it is in Hebrew, and or most of it's in Hebrew, but some of it is in Aramaic, which is interesting because Aramaic was the language of the Babylonians. That was kind of the main language of the world, if you will, of that day. And it's almost kind of like Babylon was trying to repeat the mistakes of Babel. In other words, they're trying to make the world come under one language and be one people. And the fact that some of the book of Daniel, at least what we have, our oldest manuscripts, is written in Aramaic, says that Daniel was trying to reach that group of people too. Because I'm right, he's writing in their language, trying to get them to realize, hey guys, this is not going to last if you're not to the Lord, if you're not for the Lord. So interesting. The term Jew kind of comes to widespread use during this time. You know, those Judahites, if you will, those Judah people that were taken away, carried captive to Babylon, they kind of get a derogatory term called Jews, and that stuck. And to this day, you know, we still kind of refer to them as the Jewish people, but this is where it really kind of took root. And then most people, and I would tend to agree with this as well, is really would say that the time of the Gentiles really began here. A lot of people would say, no, it started with the time of Christ and when Paul really began ministering to the Gentiles. But in terms of prophetic language, the times of the Gentiles, you would really have to say kind of started when Jerusalem got taken and was, if you will, put into Gentile hands, because the Babylonians were Gentiles. So, and since then, Jerusalem has never, until today, has never really been in the hands solely of the Jewish people, of Israel. Even when Ezra and Nehemiah come back, they are still very much a vassal state of Persia at that point. And that continues under the Greek Empire, it continues under Roman, and then of course during Rome they get destroyed again, and they've always kind of been subject to peoples, they get scattered. And so now today, they're finally back in their land. But I think you could argue that even today, they're not completely independent yet. They're still very reliant, obviously, on America, but they're very reliant on other nations as well. And Jerusalem especially is not completely in Jewish hands. You know, it's a divided city. It's 3 parts. You've got some to the Jews, you got some to the Orthodox, and you got some to the Protestants, Christians, and then you get some, actually 4 parts, and then you get, and of course then Islam. So it's not a united city yet. So it'd be pretty difficult to say that we aren't still under the times of the Gentiles. In other words, does that make sense? Because Gentiles are still very much a part of Israel and controlling that land. So that's kind of exciting and interesting, because the New Testament talks about until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And I think anybody would have to say, well, we really haven't seen that period come to an end yet, because Jesus is not reigning and ruling from Jerusalem. It's not completely in the hands, if you will, of the Israelite people, and meaning the Jewish believers, people that do believe in Jesus the Messiah, and all of us Gentiles that are part of that. That hasn't happened. So we're still in that time of the Gentiles. And as I've stated here, a lot of scholars believe that began back here in the Babylonian time. So here's how the book is divided. It's actually pretty simple. There's 12 chapters. The first 6 chapters really deal with the life of Daniel. And even the prophetic parts of chapter 2, which are very much future oriented, we have to remember that that's Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and Daniel just interprets it. So the way that Daniel is organized, it's really looking at things that Daniel dealt with, experienced, and how he interpreted and fulfilled things related to other people, if that makes sense. None of these are Daniel's specific dreams and prophecies, if that makes sense. That's why the first 6 chapters are that, but they're not chronological from the standpoint of, and I'll show you in the chronological order, his prophecies. He did have some, and they fit within this time period, but the way the book is organized is it just focuses first on the non-prophetic things in terms of Daniel's life. They're prophetic, but they're not Daniel specifically. And then the second part of the book, which I'll show you here, are his prophetic visions. All of these belong to Daniel. So that's how the book is organized. So that's somewhat of an easy way to remember and understand. The first half is more about his life and how he interpreted other people's prophetic visions and happenings. The second half is completely his and what he's talking about. And that's kind of cool because that makes it easy to kind of understand what's going on. But it's even better, I think, when we realize, but they are intertwined chronologically, what's happening here, because they feed off of each other, if you will. God shows Daniel some things that feed off of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, for example. He has a dream in chapter 2, but then Daniel has a vision in chapter 7 and another one in chapter 8, and they totally go hand in hand with Nebuchadnezzar's vision that he had and that Daniel interpreted, which is like God would do, right? He always talks about establishing things with 2 or 3 witnesses. So he gives like 3 different visions, if you will, to confirm that this happening about these 4 kingdoms, that's going to happen. And it's already started under Nebuchadnezzar, and there's different versions about different interpretations about, are those kingdoms then still future? Or are they partly past and future? And I'll talk about that all in just a second in terms of where it all goes. But I want you to see how it's organized. And like I said, every chapter is its own separate vision, with the exceptions of 10, 11, and 12. They all go together. That's one long vision that God gives to Daniel in chapters 10, 11, and 12. Just for whatever reason, when the scholars of the past divided our book into chapters, they split it up into those 3 areas, probably just to make it a little bit more easy to manage and to find things. So here's the actual chronological order. And so I'm going to encourage you to go read the book. I'm still going to talk for a little while here, but I'm going to encourage you to read the book in this order, because maybe it's just me, but I think linearly, in linear lines. I like to think in chronological order, and it just helps for me to realize how stuff builds upon itself. And so this is the way that the chapters would be in terms of how they happened. The first 4 actually are in chronological order, and they all happen during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and Daniel is a high official, a high man of wisdom in that, under Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And then you have some of these Babylonian kings that are evil. Marduk, and it's not evil's part of his name. That doesn't mean he's evil. Well, they probably were, but that's not the meaning of it in this case. And then you see the other names there going all the way down to Nabonidus, and these are Babylonian leaders that apparently didn't want to have a lot to do with Daniel, because we have nothing recorded during their time periods related to Daniel. So that's why I said Daniel, it appears, kind of disappears into the shadows a little bit during their reigns. And that would not be unusual. Whenever you have somebody come to power, oftentimes the cabinet or the people that were a part of that reign, and you see that in America. You're going to see a total changeover now of leadership and all the cabinet positions and all that. That's very typical of any government. So that's probably what happened. So Daniel kind of goes into the shadows. We don't know much about him until finally the story picks up with Belshazzar, who is the final leader of Babylon. But that's in chapter 7 and 8, and then it skips back to 5. And again, the only reason they're not in that order in Daniel is because remember how he the book was divided into Daniel stuff and then future stuff. But in terms of what's happening time-wise, all you have to do is look at the first verse of each of these chapters, and it tells us exactly what year it is of who's king. So that's how it's very easy to put these in chronological order to know where they happen. So Daniel comes back on the scene in Belshazzar's first year, and then in his third year is when he has another vision of what's happening, 7 and 8 there. And then there's Belshazzar's last year, which is back to Daniel 5, and that's the handwriting on the wall. And then that's when Babylon doesn't exist anymore. And that's why we can say fairly strongly that these last years in the book of Daniel, really from chapter 7, 8, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11 in chronological order, that these all probably happened within a 10-year time period or less, because they were the end of Babylon and the beginning of Persia. So there's definitely a gap of time in there between chapters 4 and 7. So just interesting so that you can kind of see how that happens. And then you'll see that in chapter 6 and 9, we have Darius the Mede, who's a leader under Cyrus. Some people believe Cyrus and Darius are the same person. I don't think that works. I mean, I guess it could work, but it's probably more like he's a co-leader, because remember, it's the Medes and Persians that are leading together, so that's probably why Darius is part of the Median thing, but he's still subject to Cyrus and Persia. They're still one kingdom, and they're the ones that take over because Babylon gets destroyed. And then Daniel has this huge vision in chapter 9, because now we know at chapter 9 the 70-year time period is either up or really close to being up. And then Daniel has his final vision in chapters 10, 11, and 12. So if you read them in that order, it will help to at least make sense of what's going on in Daniel's life and how it's been revealed and how things have come to pass. And that really kind of helps, because like I said, there's really two major prophetic points of Daniel's life. There's this vision of the 4 kingdoms, and that's reinforced 3 different times, Nebuchadnezzar and then 2 of Daniel's visions that he has. And then that last kingdom is expanded upon in chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. And that really especially focuses, I believe, on end times, because there's just a lot of practical ways you have to realize this hasn't been fulfilled yet. So as you go to read it, here is my suggested way to read it. And here's where I want to camp a little bit here, and then I'll stop, and then you can go read, and then the next video will then help to kind of parse some of it out so you can kind of understand some of it a little bit better. Obviously, as I've already said, read it in order, read it chronologically. So if you don't remember, rewind a little bit and pause and write down the way I had the chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then how it skips to 7, 8, then 5, 6, then 9, 10, 11, 12. You can write that on a piece of paper and you can read them in that order. So that will really help you. Second thing, really look for phrases like latter days and last days, because those terms are used, not a lot, but they are used several times, and they are used of all these, especially these visions that Daniel has. Also, though, in terms of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And so that really has to tell us something, that this has to refer to the last days. Now, here's the issue, and here's where a lot of different Bible scholars disagree about this. And they're all great men and women of God, and so I don't want to throw anybody under the bus here. But I'm sharing with you where I've come to the conclusion on this. And you'll see my last point there is that most of this has to be future. And let me explain to you why. In the book of Daniel, it talks about a period of time when there's going to be a person that comes to power, and he's going to be the abomination of desolation. That same term that Jesus himself uses in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. He talks about this abomination of desolation. Daniel uses that term as well. And of course, Jesus said, consider what Daniel, talked about in Matthew. So what everybody, well, not everybody, there's kind of a couple positions. One is that they believe most of Daniel, except for maybe chapter 12, applies to Antiochus Epiphanes about the 167 BC time period. This is the period where he came in and he sacrificed a pig. I've talked about this before in class, but for those of you that haven't seen before or known any of this, he's one of the branches off of the Greek Empire, and he's very cruel, if you will, very brutal against the Jewish people, not just the Jewish people, but especially the Jewish people. And he does these things, and he fulfills, it seems on the surface, he seems to fulfill a lot of the things in the book of Daniel. The problem is, there's two problems with that, though, in saying, well, then that must be all of Daniel is done then. It's over with, it's been fulfilled, except for maybe chapter 12. Here's the problem with saying that. There's two big issues. Number one, when you read it really carefully, and we will look at some of these in the next video as well, when you look at it, you realize Antiochus Epiphanes did not fulfill all of these. For example, Antiochus Epiphanes really did not set himself up as being like God. He was a Zeus follower. He believed that Zeus was the major god of the day, and so he really focused more on that, not so much on him. So already you have kind of a hard time saying, well, that's got to be the person that Daniel talks about, because Daniel goes on and talks about how this leader sets himself up higher than every god except for the God that he worships. I guess you could argue maybe that Antiochus Epiphanes did that, but again, what happens right after that is God sets up his kingdom on this earth. So you'd have to say, well, that couldn't have been 167 BC because that didn't happen. So that's still future. So that's the first problem with why, and there's many others, but that's the first problem. The second problem is because Jesus himself referred to the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24, you have to remember that Matthew 24 was 167, actually now 197 years after this with Antiochus Epiphanes. So if Jesus is referring to the abomination of desolation, then he is telling us that that's still a future event after him, after Jesus. So it couldn't have been Antiochus Epiphanes. He was not the fulfillment of the abomination of desolation in the book of Daniel. He was a type, he foreshadowed the future Antichrist, but he couldn't have been the Antichrist because Jesus is on the scene now, and he's telling us that the Antichrist, the abomination of desolation, is still to come. He tells his disciples, when you see the abomination of desolation set up in the temple, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and go read it in Matthew 24:15. So the fact that he tells us that's a really huge clue that Antiochus Epiphanes is not the fulfillment of the book of Daniel. And that alone tells us we need to go back and rethink a lot of the book of Daniel, because that means a lot of it is applied to the future Antichrist. Because if Jesus applied it to him, then the other facts about it in Daniel must apply to the future Antichrist as well. So that's important. Then there's another group of scholars that says, okay, well, I agree with you on that. They would say, yeah, Dr. Roth, you're right. It couldn't have been Antiochus Epiphanes. But there was another person after Jesus in 70 AD who did destroy the temple, and his name was Titus. He was a Roman general, and shortly after 70 AD, he actually became a Roman emperor, the next Roman emperor. And he was responsible, and so he must be the fulfillment of that abomination of desolation in the book of Daniel. And so then that group of people, they'll kind of come to the same conclusion as the first group. They'll say Daniel has all been fulfilled, except for maybe, again, parts of chapter 12. But they'll say it's all been fulfilled because Titus fulfilled that. Again, the first problem that was the problem with the Antiochus theory still exists. Namely, after Titus destroyed Jerusalem, Jesus didn't come back. The Messiah didn't come back and set up his kingdom on this earth. We're not living in a kingdom now. This has been almost 2,000 years ago now. And we're still waiting for that piece of the puzzle to happen. So it's really difficult to say that Titus fulfilled that part of the scriptures. That's pretty hard to throw out there. Second problem with it is the book of Revelation, most all scholars agree, was written after AD 70. Most of us argue, and just about any commentary you look at and any serious scholar that really looks into this would say that Revelation was written about 90 AD, in 90 to 95 AD. That's 20 years after Jerusalem got destroyed in AD 70. And Revelation refers all the way back to all the things going on in Daniel as well as picking up from Jesus. And remember that Revelation is the revelation of Jesus to John, to the disciple John. So Jesus is literally telling us through the book of Revelation, guys, what happened in 70 AD still wasn't it. That's not the end. So for those two reasons especially, I think that the other group that argues Daniel's all been fulfilled through Titus, I think they're mistaken as well, because you just logically you have to say there's just too many things that didn't happen yet. They have to be fulfilled. So they are still future oriented. So that's kind of my really short version. And trust me, this is over years and years of study, but I just, logically speaking, this has to be the thing that we're looking at when you look at the book of Daniel. So there's kind of three questions that as you read through them in chronological order, and these are the things that helped me process and come to the conclusion that I'm sharing with you. Has it been fulfilled yet? And in 90% of the cases, no, it hasn't all been fulfilled yet. Yes, there was Babylon, and then there was Persia Empire, and then there was Greece. But then there's this fourth kingdom that's never named in the book of Daniel. A lot of scholars will say, oh, well, it's Rome. It's got to be Rome. But it never says it's Rome in the book of Daniel itself. It does identify the Medes and Persians in Greece, but it never identifies Rome as that fourth empire. And as I shared with you in Jeremiah, and I'll go a little bit more detail when we get to Daniel chapter 9, when you look at that chapter, you realize that's something that has to be fulfilled future as well. That's a prophecy to the time of Christ, and there's still this 7 years out there hanging that has to be fulfilled. So you have to answer just in the affirmative, because like chapter 12 talks about the resurrection in the book of Daniel. Well, that hasn't been fulfilled yet. So if Daniel 12 hasn't fulfilled, why would we assume everything else in Daniel has been fulfilled? That just doesn't make logical sense in terms of good hermeneutics with Bible. So no offense to my brethren that argue otherwise, but there's just no way that all the book of Daniel could have been fulfilled in 70 AD. That's just, it doesn't work, in other words. And I think as you look through it, you can kind of see that. And then the other two questions that go hand in hand with that, of course, did Antiochus Epiphanes fulfill all this? And no. And again, I'll point out some specifics when we get there about how he couldn't be the fulfillment of it, especially because Jesus said the abomination of desolation is still to come after him. And then did Titus fulfill all of that? And I'll share some things with you too there, why I don't believe he fulfills that by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, you could almost argue that Antiochus fulfilled it more than Titus did in terms of the description. So, but Titus doesn't really fulfill that full description either. So when you answer all those questions, that's when you have to stop and say, you know what? This abomination of desolation that Jesus refers to in Matthew 24, this is a future prophetic word, and it's still something that has to happen. And it's something that the book of Revelation itself talks about as well, because Revelation talks about the Antichrist. It talks about the beast and the false prophet and the dragon, who is Satan himself. So it talks about this false trinity that's coming. So when you put all those pieces together and you realize how much Revelation is drawing from the book of Daniel, you have to make the logical conclusion that Daniel must be a lot of end times prophetic type of a stuff. So as I said in the second bullet point, when Daniel talks about the last days or the latter days, he is literally talking about the last days, the latter days. Nothing that's past. It's all future still. Most of it's still future. There's a few things, obviously, that have fulfilled, which is confirmation that Daniel knew what he was talking about. There's many steps to it, but a lot of the stuff he's talking about with this fourth kingdom and an Antichrist figure that's coming, that's future. You know, those are things that we still are looking to see. Not looking forward to it by any stretch, but it's something that's going to happen. It has to happen. So anyway, that's why I believe that it fits there. And then with Daniel 9, as I will point out, there's so many different theories and ideas about what that what the 70 times 7 means, that the only one that fits is the fact that it's from the time that the decree goes out for Jerusalem till the time of Christ's crucifixion. And if some people shifted it to his birth, that 33 years difference, that's not here nor there in terms of prophetic time. But that's the only prophetic word that makes sense. There's no other time period where that 490 years makes sense anywhere else. So it has to be that. In other words, it has to be to the Daniel was telling us, okay, here's the time that Jesus is going to come, and then there's still the 7-year period hanging out there waiting to be completely fulfilled, to complete, if you will, that 490 years. And I know that honestly, that's the one thing that we're the most, I don't want to say problematic, but the most difficult to explain to people, because they're like, well, that doesn't make sense, Doug, because why would you have a 490 year time period and 483 of the years are together, and then the 7 years are split out and separate from that? And I admit that can be a problematic way to look at it, but here's kind of, I think, the way to look at that and answer that. First of all, in Daniel itself, when we look at it, and when you do the reading in Daniel chapter 9, you'll notice that Daniel chapter 9 itself actually splits those 490 years into 3 parts. So Daniel himself realizes they're 490 years, but there's 3 parts to it. The first 2 parts have happened. There's still a 3rd part that needs to happen. So the fact that he split it into different parts tells us, it can be done that way. And then, of course, the second thing is just there's no other logical place to put those years. Where do you put 490 years prophetically? And scholars have tried to do all kinds of different manipulations of when those 490 years have already happened, and none of them just work, and none of them agree with each other. And so that, to me, tells me, well, none of those can really probably be right, because nobody's in any agreement about this. Whereas when you realize that it definitely takes us to the crucifixion, the 483s, and then there's still 7 years to be fulfilled that haven't been fulfilled yet, that makes the most sense, because that fits the whole idea of the 1 week, and the fact that Paul himself talked about a future Antichrist figure that's going to come. The book of Revelation talks about a future Antichrist. Jesus talks about a future abomination of desolation, who's the Antichrist. I mean, when you see all that, then you realize, yes, there's still a future time period that's coming. And so on the issue of the 7 years, I think that most Bible scholars are probably on track. I think that we have that right. Where I think maybe we don't have the timing right is when the rapture fits within all that 7 years. That's a whole nother discussion, I realize, but I shared that with you in the very first video, where I think that all probably where it fits better. But I think in terms of the idea of a future 7 years, if you will, the final week of Daniel, the final 7 years of Daniel, I think that is what makes the most sense, that we do have a time period coming that's going to be fairly intense, and it's going to be a 7-year time period. I'm not sure that we'll know when that period actually begins. Some people are trying to say, well, we're in it now with all this coronavirus. Possibly. I think that that's probably doesn't fit though yet. I think there's still too many things that still need to happen, not the least of which, obviously, we need to see a temple in Jerusalem. Now, that could happen pretty quickly. I totally admit that. But the fact that there's still a lot of things that need to happen, I think we can still keep studying Scripture and just be on the lookout. We're not doing any of this so that we can be fearful or worry about anything. It's just so we can be better informed, to know what to look for, and to help our brethren to stay strong as times get more and more difficult through tribulation. We gotta help our brothers stay strong, and we have to minister to the Jewish people and try to get them to see that Jesus is their Messiah, that he's really the one, and he's the one that's coming back, and he's going to set this all up and do it. So we still have a lot of work, because I don't want this just to be information. I want it to lead to something for us to be good doers of the word, and to know where to put our resources, what ministries we should be giving to, how we should be praying, all that kind of good stuff. That's kind of the meat behind it. So that's the overview. That I realized I didn't do this with any of the other books, but Daniel is so important to end times prophecy that we have to have a good understanding of where it is. So if at all possible, And because I'm posting these, you can go watch them anytime. So I'm really going to encourage you, before you go watch the next one on the book of Daniel, read all 12 chapters. And if that takes you, several days, if it takes you several weeks, then do that, because I really think that will really help. And be forewarned that, yeah, you're going to get into a few chapters where the details are going to overwhelm you. Like, my goodness, what is all this going on with these northern kingdoms, southern kingdoms, all this kind of stuff? Don't let that overwhelm you. Just read it from the standpoint of ask the Holy Spirit to kind of give you wisdom and insight. And then when you watch the next video, then we can kind of dig deeper into the specifics of the visions of what's happening, how they fit together, and what I think is end times type of stuff. And then you can, from that point, you can make a decision on your own. It says, I think Doug's full of baloney, or you can say, you know what, I think he might be onto something. But at least if you've read it for yourself and you've let the Holy Spirit show you some things, when I share what I think is the most logical interpretation of it, then you can make a better decision on whether you think that's an accurate way to go with it or not. So I'm going to stop there because I have talked for almost an hour, and I'm going to let you go read, and then we will see you on the next video. So happy reading, and we will see you next time. Blessings.